Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears as we speak together about chapter 17 of Fawn Brodie's No Man Knows My History, Ordeal in Liberty Jail. Liberty Jail is one of the few episodes of church history that actually does get taught to the rising generation of Mormon youth because of the opportunistic attempt on the Mormon Church's behalf to use the letters that Joseph Smith wrote during that period of confinement as this rallying cry for Mormonism, for faith in God, because of its powerful rhetoric. In many ways, the letter from Liberty Jail is quite similar to Mormons culturally in terms of this big letter, an event that gets spoken about, similarly to the letter Martin Luther King Jr. wrote while incarcerated in Birmingham jail, and the famous letter he wrote to the pastors about the civil rights movement and his arguments. The rhetoric isn't really the same. It's just, I mentioned them side by side because Mormons view this scene of Joseph Smith in Liberty Jail as a really pivotal moment, and it enters into Mormon discourse quite frequently. I think of the poor saints that are forced to see Joseph Smith kind of be paraded before them as a hostage, as a prisoner of war. They're calling it the Mormon War, which was this conflict of post-Kirtland Danites that have inflicted the beliefs of Mormonism by the sword, or as they would have it, and their skirmishes with the old settlers of Missouri, which again are not exactly the cream of the crop of 1830s society, quite the opposite in many ways. But I think of Fawn Brodie here. She says, "This was the bitterest day Far West could ever see. Before the surrender there had been terror, but terror matched by courage and a steadfast resolve to die for the prophet's sake. Now there was only despair." And the scene that brought to my head for that was Lord of the Rings and Return of the King, when the mouth of Sauron comes out from the Black Gate of Mordor to taunt them with the mithril of Frodo, to get them to believe that Frodo had already been captured and was killed. And of course, the epic scene that follows after that. But that, you can imagine the demoralizing effect that seeing Joseph Smith in chains, in handcuffs or whatever, coming by on horseback as in front of your humiliated village. That is really tough. And of course, to the victor goes the spoils and the opportunity to write history. History, I've come to realize more as I mature as an adult, is written by the victors. That is not a cliche phrase. That I think that's very, very true, and no more is it prevalent than in this moment where the General Clark says that you have always been the aggressors. You have brought upon yourselves these difficulties by being disaffected and not being subject to rule. And while there may be some truth to the fact that obviously there was conflict on both sides of this war, it seems pretty clear from the evidence that Fawn Brodie puts forth before and during this chapter that there was a whole heap of unwarranted persecution heaped upon the heads of the Mormons for no good reason. There were some good reasons, but the majority of the persecution that the Mormons faced was unjust, and the legal system was used, or I should say abused, to help get the settlers to win in their victory over these new Mormon settlers. So one of the persons that is most influential in the trial in which Joseph Smith is put on trial for all of these crimes, being the leader of this now defunct military unit, it says that Samson Avard was one of the people that dished everything. He was an opportunist and a coward, the book says, and I think of this as being particularly satisfactory because he was so influential as a voice in the last few chapters, being one of the loudest war hawks trying to use bloodshed to spread Mormonism by the sword. And so, of course, he gets in trial, and not only is he a coward, but he's also a snitch. And it really exposes him for the man lacking principle that he is. I think it's very interesting that it talks about Daniel's prophecy of the stone rolling down the mountain cut without hands. I was taught this scripture in my mission experience and was led to believe that the kingdom of God would take over all the earth and all of the secular governments would tumble down as we prepare for the second coming of Jehovah. And we're here in 2021, it's about to be 2022, and the Mormon Church did not fare well during the COVID pandemic that started at the end of 2019. They didn't even publish church statistics of population and demography because it's rumored that it is so embarrassingly bad. Of course, when the pandemic gets over, the numbers will probably bounce back somewhat to the pre-pandemic levels. Although at the current rate of attrition the Mormons are establishing now, it may not exist by the time COVID is well and done. The Mormon Church is not a stone cut from the mountain without hands. It is less than 1% of 1% of the world's total population, and it will never rise above that level because as many children as each Mormon couple can have, that's becoming increasingly more difficult due to economic troubles sustained in this century. Our parents and grandparents fared much better in the post-World War II economy here in the developed world, and their lives looked a lot more optimistic than they do for us. I'm in my mid-20s. I am a college graduate, wondering if it was even worth it to go to college due to the return on investment being much lower than it has been in the past. It's been unseasonably warm all throughout December here in Utah, and it'll snow and then it'll melt like immediately. So the climate change is being seen. There was just horrific record-setting tornadoes ripping through Kentucky in that part of the United States just a week or two ago, and that's just one of many storms that are hitting. So the world looks a lot different. And certainly none of the evidence of my observations of today's world suggest anything close to the prophecy of Daniel being fulfilled as it pertains to the Latter-day Saints taking over the world. It's quite the opposite. So Joseph Smith does write a letter to his people to explain himself, give an apology, defend his actions. It says he did not deny responsibility for the Danites, but blamed Avard for teaching many false and pernicious things of which he had been ignorant as well as innocent. This reeks of failed leadership. He is textbook passing the buck. The buck stops here, is what the U.S. President Harry Truman said, and made famous that phrase. The buck stops here. When there are problems or things to be held accountable for, then you are the only person that can account. Never throw other people under the bus. Joseph found too easy a scapegoat in Avard, and he places the blame on other people. I didn't know about the Danites. I didn't know what kind of language was being spoken during the Danite meetings, which is not true because he was there, endorsed it, and even wrote some pretty fiery rhetoric of his own to that group. So he's not being truthful here. He's lying for the Lord, maybe. So I think this is a stark example of failed leadership. There's some moments where he has good leadership, and this is not one of them. And it continues in that pattern in the modern day Mormon Church because The future prophet, next in line, Dallin H. Oakes, has stated that the church is not in the position to give apologies and never will be due to apologies. I don't remember exactly what he said. Basically, they're not productive. And so you see that lineage of Joseph Smith passing the buck to other people. I think it's interesting that it talks about this Turner Committee who goes over all these reports of the grievous injustices being put on the Mormon settlers in Missouri, and they choose not to publish it. This is the same country, the United States, who has painted a narrative that the worst people in the world are people like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, who are famous for whistleblowing and telling the truth about massive governmental criticism, failures and corruption in the United States government, leaking millions of documents to people to see the ways that imperialism is continuing on, and mass surveillance in the 21st century is a massive threat to democracy and privacy, things like that. This is the same country. So it's so disheartening to read how these lawmakers and people in positions of power and leadership could see just how horribly the Mormons had been treated, especially the graphic imagery of Hans Mill. They know about all of these documents and they choose not to publish it. And it was a unanimous decision not to publish it. So this is really disheartening because these sorts of injustices are taking place in the modern American landscape. You could almost make the argument, I think quite cogently, that America was founded on these sorts of principles, and it's no secret that our country operates the way it does. It's baked in to our country's founding, who was founded by revolutionaries who happen to also be revolutionary slave owners. It is built into our nation's founding. It is extremely ironic and brings an insane amount of schadenfreude to read the part of the Mormons going into Illinois, being treated respectfully as the persecuted refugees they believe themselves to be. They cross the Mississippi River and are in Illinois, and they immediately get scammed by real estate. These speculators and real estate agents. It is a racket. If you have to pay to have a shelter, or you can choose to not pay to have a shelter and be homeless, if those are your two alternatives, then I think that's an unjust system, and it's just kind of laughable that we allow a government to tell us who gets to have land and who doesn't. And that land can be sold by the acre, by the yard, by the foot. That fence lines can be drawn in exact shapes. It's very curious that humans are so obsessed with the idea of the modern conception of land ownership. It's something that we should think about. I appreciate that Joseph Smith has such an expansive and ambitious theology and philosophy and worldview. He says, whether there be one God or many gods, they shall be manifest. This is really exciting, and I think it's one of the things that Mormon theology is more appealing to me than mainstream Catholicism or Protestant movements, is that I feel like Mormonism is way more open to a much broader scope of God, or at least that the language, of course I was indoctrinated to believe these things as a child, so that bias is coming through unwillingly, but the theology makes a lot of sense if you are a person who believes in the supernatural, and there's a lot of many very interesting theological implications that came uniquely from Joseph Smith. I think this is one thing that people who defend the Book of Mormon get so upset about, is it doesn't so much matter if it was literally true, because Joseph Smith, even if it was him as the author the whole time and none of it was literal truth, he still introduced all these really interesting things that kind of it was kind of punk. It was kind of a reaction to Protestantism. So there's a lot of things that are interesting about that. I think it's interesting. We have proof. Well, I shouldn't say proof. We have primary sources indicating that Lucinda Morgan Harris was a mistress of the prophet. I think there's nothing wrong with consenting adults engaging in the bedroom with whom they choose, but in the case of Emma, who he's writing all these letters from Liberty Jail saying that I miss you and only you, and God knows when we will be reunited, all the same time that he's accepting visits and letters from other women who are probably getting somewhat of the same language. He writes Lucinda Morgan Harris this letter saying that there was a great plan that he would soon unfold to his most faithful followers. So I take with what, if that matters to you, I think it's interesting to note that we know from one primary source here, and there will be much more to come, that Joseph Smith was engaged in licentious behavior with dozens of willing hosts. This quote that Joseph Smith includes in his letter from March 25, 1839, is so interesting in the Russell M. Nelson era of modern mainstream Mormonism. Yet shall Mormonism stand. Water, fire, truth, and God are all realities. Truth is Mormonism. God is the author of it. Think about that in relation to Russell M. Nelson saying that the name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and to call us Mormons is a victory for Satan, and that God detests our label as Mormons. And yet many people by this time in church history associated Mormon with more good, like Gordon B. Hinckley said. Originally, it was a derogatory term, but the Mormons kind of owned it. And Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism himself, says that God is the author of Mormonism. So it just seems so abundantly clear that Russell M. Nelson clearly is not in tune with his own church's history on that front. So that's really interesting. And I just want to say to end that Joseph Smith is the luckiest human being on planet Earth. I don't believe in karma. I don't believe in the Western Judeo-Christian God. I don't believe in anything supernatural. But my goodness, it really seems like Joseph Smith was just born lucky. He was just blessed to be lucky, I guess, because he just seems to get out of everything. He's escaping people. This man has been in horrific debt his entire life. Even from childhood, he grew up escaping creditors and things like that. His entire church was founded on heaps of borrowed money that they never were able to really repay. All these things. And he goes to jail. He basically starts a war between citizens of the United States and the Mormon Danites. He does all these things, and yet he just always survives. It is like he has plot armor. It sounds like a Netflix special or something like that. He just can't seem to die. So I think it's interesting. With $800 and a jug of whiskey, the successful Hiram was able to rescue Joseph. And $800 and whiskey is a small price to pay for the prophet of God. That's all for this chapter, and I'm very excited as we go into the next chapter, chapter 18, because we're finally going to one of the most fascinating and intriguing moments in church history, Nauvoo, Illinois. See you then.